Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. A loud bang echoed through the neighborhood, followed by a long, agonizing hiss. A car screeched to a stop, its front tire completely flattened, impaled on the sharp metal spikes protruding from the ground. The driver, a middle-aged man in a wrinkled polo, leaped out, his face contorted in rage. Who the hell puts tire spikes in their own driveway? From the front porch, Jake sipped his coffee, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. He had been waiting for this moment. But let's rewind a few weeks back to when his peaceful life took a sharp nosedive. Thanks to the HOA, Jake had moved into his dream home just 6 months ago, a charming 2-story house with a beautifully paved driveway. It was everything he had worked for. It sat in a quiet, well-managed neighborhood. And while he had heard horror stories about the HOA, he hadn't run into any problems until now. He kept his yard maintained, followed the community rules, and mostly kept to himself. Everything seemed perfect. Then the letter arrived. A neatly folded notice sat in his mailbox, stamped with the dreaded Homeowners Association board seal. That was never a good sign. He ripped it open, his eyes scanning the content. At first, the words didn't register. Then his stomach twisted in disbelief. Per HOA Regulation 14B, any unused driveways within the community are eligible for communal parking allocation effective immediately. Your driveway has been designated as an overflow parking zone. What the hell? Jake read it again. Sure, he had misunderstood. His driveway? Community parking? He paid for this property. Was this some kind of joke? His blood boiled as he read the next line. Failure to comply with this regulation may result in HOA fines and additional penalties. His hands tightened around the letter. Oh, hell no. This had to be illegal. He stormed into his house and immediately pulled up the HOA bylaws, scouring them for some kind of clause that would override this nonsense. But the wording was vague, just enough legal fluff to make it technically valid. Frustrated, he decided to confront the person responsible, Linda, the head of the HOA. Linda was the kind of person who took her title a little too seriously. Late 50s, a sharp bob cut, always seen clutching a clipboard like it was a scepter of power. She had a reputation for being a control freak who thrived on making residents miserable. If anyone would have a smug explanation for this insanity, it was her. Jake marched over to the HOA office, the letter clenched in his fist. He barely made it through the door before Linda greeted him with that condescending smile she always wore. "Oh, Jake, I was expecting you." Her voice dripped with faux sweetness. "I assume you got the notice?" "What the hell is this?" He waved the letter at her. "Since when does the HOA get to steal my driveway and turn it into a public parking lot?" Linda let out a practiced, patronizing chuckle. "It's not stealing, Jake. It's community sharing. The board made this decision to better allocate space for residents who..." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "So you're telling me that people can just park in my driveway now without my permission?" Linda folded her hands neatly on the desk. "Well, technically, yes. Since you don't always use it, we figured it would be best to make it available for residents who have additional vehicles. We already have a system in place. Residents can register to park there on a first-come, first-served basis." Jake let out a humorless laugh. "This is insane. I didn't sign up for this." "Oh, but you did." Linda tapped the HOA contract. "You see, the bylaws clearly state that unused driveways may be allocated for communal purposes. The board voted, and the decision is final." Jake's temper flared. "I own this property. The driveway is mine. You can't just decide it belongs to the community." Linda's smile widened, her tone syrupy sweet. "Oh, but we can. The land is subject to HOA governance, Jake. If you have an issue, you can always file a formal complaint at the next board meeting." He clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what that meant. The board was stacked with Linda's loyal followers. Filing a complaint would be useless. Realizing he was getting nowhere, Jake left, slamming the door behind him. But if Linda thought he would just roll over and accept this, she was dead wrong. The next morning, his worst fears were confirmed. As he stepped outside to get his morning coffee, he froze. 3 cars were parked in his driveway. Not 1, not 2, but 3, a rusty Toyota, a silver minivan, and a sleek black Mercedes, all taking up a space like it was a freaking public parking lot. Jake's blood pressure skyrocketed. Who the hell did these people think they were? Marching over to the nearest car, he knocked on the window. A woman in sunglasses lowered it, looking mildly annoyed. "Yes, you're in my driveway," he said, barely controlling his anger. "Move your car." She blinked. "I registered this spot through the HOA. I don't care." His voice came out sharper than intended. "This is my property." The woman simply shrugged. "Take it up with Linda." Oh, he would. Jake stormed back into his house and called the police. This had to be trespassing. There was no way this was legal. When the officer arrived, Jake explained the situation, handing over the HOA notice as proof of their absurd decision. The cop scratched his head, looking uncomfortable. "I hate to say this, but technically the HOA does have authority over shared spaces." Jake nearly lost his mind. "It's not a shared space. It's my driveway." "I agree, man. It's messed up, but unless the bylaw is overturned, there's nothing I can do." Jake stared in disbelief as the cop walked away. So that was it. He was just supposed to let complete strangers take over his property? That night, the situation got worse. More cars showed up, 5 this time. It was a full-blown free-for-all. People littered in his driveway, left oil stains, and some even sat on his porch like they belonged there. The final straw came at 2 a.m. Jake caught some random guy peeing near his garage. That was it. Jake wasn't just mad anymore. He was furious. If they want to play dirty, fine, he'd play dirty too. They wanted community parking? He'd give them a parking lot they'd never forget. Jake was done playing nice the moment he saw that guy relieving himself near his garage. Something inside him snapped. He grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, fury burning in his veins. "Hey," he shouted. The guy nearly jumped out of his shoes, zipping up in a panic before scrambling toward his car. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake demanded. Sorry, man," the guy stammered. I don't care what you were just doing. This is my driveway." The guy mumbled something, yanked his car door open, and sped off into the night. But Jake wasn't satisfied. He turned his gaze to the other cars sitting in his driveway like they belonged there. He was done watching people treat his property like a public lot. The next morning, he parked his truck horizontally across the driveway, blocking every single spot. It was his driveway. After all, he had every right to park there. If these freeloaders wanted to use his property, they have to go through him first. But it didn't take long for the retaliation to start. By mid-morning, there was a notice taped to his front door. "You are in violation of HOA Parking Policy 14B. Blocking access to community spaces will result in fines. Please remove your vehicle immediately or face penalties." Jake laughed out loud. These people were delusional. They were fining him for blocking his own property. He crumpled the notice and tossed it aside. An hour later, his phone rang. It was Linda. "Jake," she said in her most patronizing tone, "we've received several complaints that you're intentionally obstructing a designated community parking space." "Oh, you mean my driveway?" Jake shot back. "Jake," Linda sighed, "I'm trying to be reasonable here. We've worked very hard to create a fair and functional system for the community." "Fair?" Jake barked a laugh. "You stole my driveway." "Jake, you agreed to the HOA's policies when you moved in. If you continue to defy the rules, you'll be issued a fine of $50 per obstruction." He gritted his teeth. "Let me get this straight. You're fining me for parking in my own driveway?" "Not at all," she replied smoothly. "You're being fined for blocking community access. If you'd like, I can schedule you for a hearing with the HOA board to discuss this further." "A hearing?" "Right, like that would do anything." He hung up before she could say another word. By that evening, another 3 tickets had been taped to his door, totaling $150 in fines. This was beyond absurd. The HOA was bleeding him dry all because he had the audacity to fight back. But things were only going to get worse. The next day, more cars arrived. Word had apparently spread that his driveway was free real estate, and now random strangers were parking there. A group of teenagers parked their beat-up sedan, blasting music at full volume. A guy leaned against his garage, scrolling through his phone like he lived there. An older man in a suit pulled up in a luxury SUV, stepped out, and waved at Jake like they were best friends. "Hey, buddy," the man called out. "I'll only be here for a few hours. Hope you don't mind." Jake nearly popped a blood vessel. "Oh, I mind," he growled. The man chuckled, brushing him off. "Come on, don't be like that," the HOA said. "It's all good." Jake clenched his fist. He was this close to keying the guy's car on principle. By nightfall, the situation spiraled further out of control. A group of college kids decided to host a tailgate party in his driveway. They set up foldable chairs, cracked open beers, and started grilling hot dogs like they were at a damn sports event. Jake stood at his window, stunned beyond words. This was his home, his property, and the HOA had legally turned it into a free-for-all. That's when he knew the HOA didn't just want to take his driveway. They wanted to break him. They were waiting for him to snap, to give in, to move out so they could take control. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. At midnight, he pulled out his laptop and started digging through the HOA bylaws. If they were going to play dirty, he'd beat them at their own game. It took hours, but finally he found it. Buried deep in the legal jargon was a loophole. Rule 22D. Homeowners may implement reasonable safety measures to protect personal property, so long as they do not interfere with pedestrian access. Jake's lips curled into a slow, satisfied grin. Safety measures. The next morning, he got to work. First, he went online and ordered removable tire spikes, the kind used in private lots to stop unauthorized parking. They weren't technically permanent, which meant they weren't a violation of HOA policy. Next, he went to the hardware store and bought bright yellow, private property, no parking signs. HOA rules didn't prohibit homeowners from posting safety warnings. By noon, he was out in his driveway installing his masterpiece, a custom-built removable spike strip, hidden just enough to be unnoticed but effective enough to teach people a lesson. Linda and the HOA wanted a fight? Well, they just got one. Jake leaned back, admiring his handiwork. The trap was set. Now all he had to do was wait. Jake didn't have to wait long. By the next morning, the first victim of his trap arrived bright and early. A man in a sleek black BMW, the kind of guy who probably thought rules didn't apply to him. He pulled into the driveway like he owned the place, completely ignoring the bright yellow, private property, no parking signs Jake had put up the night before. Jake stood at his window, sipping his coffee, heart pounding in anticipation. The car rolled forward, then bang. A loud metal crunch echoed through the neighborhood, followed by a long, drawn-out hissing sound. The BMW came to a lurching stop. Jake grinned from his vantage point. He could see the front tires completely shredded. The driver, a man in a designer polo and shorts, sunglasses, flung the door open and jumped out, his face a twisted mask of anger and confusion. He crouched down beside his ruined tires, staring at them like he couldn't believe what had just happened. "What the hell?" he yelled, running his hands through his hair. Jake stepped outside, making a show of stretching casually. "Oh no," he said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "What happened?" The guy glared at him. "My tires. There's some kind of spikes here." Jake feigned surprise. "Spikes? Oh, you must mean my safety deterrent. You know, for trespassers." He gestured to the signs. "Didn't you see the warning?" The guy's face turned beet red. "You can't do this. This is illegal." Jake shrugged. "Actually, it's not. According to HOA Rule 22D, homeowners are allowed to install safety measures to protect their property. You parked on private property. That damage is on you, buddy." The guy opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around, probably hoping someone would back him up, but the neighborhood was silent. People were watching from their windows, but no one was stepping in to defend him. "Better call a tow truck," Jake said cheerfully before heading back inside. But that was only the beginning. By the end of the day, more cars had fallen victim to his safety deterrents. One guy in a pickup truck tried to argue with Jake, demanding he pay for the damages. Jake simply pointed at the signs, the HOA bylaws, and the fact that he wasn't the one who illegally parked in someone else's driveway. By day 2, word had spread. People were furious, but they also stopped parking in his driveway, except for one person, Linda. That evening, as Jake was grilling on his back patio, he heard the unmistakable screech of tires stopping abruptly, then a familiar and enraged voice. "Jake!" He smirked before even turning around. Linda stood in his driveway, absolutely fuming, her expensive heels clicking furiously against the pavement as she marched toward his house. "You're in violation of HOA policy," she snapped, waving a clipboard like it was a weapon. Jake took a slow sip of his beer. "Am I?" She shoved a notice into his chest. "You've created a hazard in a designated community space. You are ordered to remove those spikes immediately, or you will face severe fines and possible eviction." Jake barely glanced at the paper before tearing it in half. Linda gasped. "You can't just." "Actually, I can," he grinned, enjoying how red her face was getting. "You see, Linda, you made the rules and guess what? I followed them." Her eyes twitched. "This is harassment," she sputtered. "You're endangering vehicles." Jake crossed his arms. "So let me get this straight. When people were damaging my property by parking here, that was totally fine, but now that they're damaging theirs, suddenly it's a problem?" Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She clearly hadn't expected this level of pushback. She switched tactics. "The HOA will take legal action." Jake leaned in slightly. "You do that, but keep in mind I have every incident documented." He pulled out his phone and started scrolling. "I've got pictures, videos, and even a few police reports about trespassing and vandalism." "Oh, and did I mention I've also contacted a lawyer?" Linda went pale. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I absolutely would." For the first time, she looked nervous. She took a step back, glancing at the neighbors peeking from behind their curtains. Jake smirked. "I'll tell you what, Linda, you drop the fines, rescind the parking rule, and admit this whole thing was a power trip gone wrong, and maybe, just maybe, I'll think about removing the spikes." She clenched her jaws so tight he thought her teeth might crack. "You'll regret this," she hissed. Jake just smiled wider. "I doubt it." With a final glare, Linda spun on her heel and stomped away. And just like that, he knew he had won. But the war, the war wasn't over yet. Jake knew Linda wouldn't back down that easily. People like her thrived on power, and she had just been publicly humiliated. He had called her bluff, and now she was scrambling for a way to strike back. He just didn't know how soon it would come. The answer arrived the next morning in the form of an emergency HOA meeting notice delivered straight to his door in an envelope stamped urgent. The note inside was almost laughable. "Due to recent infractions against HOA policy and actions that endangered community safety, the board will be voting on mandatory compliance measures, up to and including fines, legal action, and potential revocation of property privileges. Attendance is mandatory." Jake let out a slow breath. So this was it. Linda had gone nuclear. This was her last stand, and if he didn't handle it right, she might actually find a way to push him out. But Jake wasn't walking into this fight unarmed. He had evidence, he had public support, and most importantly, he had a plan. When the meeting rolled around that evening, the HOA clubhouse was packed. This wasn't just a typical board meeting with a handful of retirees nodding along to whatever Linda wanted. Half the neighborhood had shown up. Jake stepped inside, and every eye turned to him. He saw some friendly nods from people who had witnessed the madness of the driveway takeover and knew he was in the right. But there were also people who looked uneasy, whispering behind their hands. Linda, of course, sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the smug dictator she thought she was. Her clipboard was in front of her, stacked with papers Jake knew were full of bogus infractions. She tapped her pen against the desk. "Now that we're all here, let's begin." Jake took a seat. He kept his expression neutral and collected. Linda cleared her throat, putting on her best fake concerned voice. "As you all know, we've recently encountered some challenges in regard to community parking regulations." She didn't look at Jake, but the pointed way she spoke made it obvious who she was talking about. "While we understand that homeowners have certain rights, the HOA must ensure that all rules and regulations are followed for the betterment of the community." Community? There were a few murmurs and some nods. Jake could see how she was slowly trying to turn the room against him. "We've received multiple complaints regarding aggressive deterrents being used to prevent parking in designated areas," she continued smoothly. "This behavior is not only unneighborly, but it also poses a risk to residents. As such, the board has gathered to vote on a formal motion." She lifted a page from her clipboard. "Effective immediately, The board will decide whether or not the homeowner at 214 Oak View Drive, she paused just for dramatic effect, will be required to remove unauthorized deterrents, pay all accrued fines, and cease all obstruction of community property. Jake didn't react, but inside he was grinning. She thought she had him. She thought she was about to win. Linda looked up. Before we vote, does the homeowner in question have anything to say in their defense? Jake leaned forward slowly. Actually, yeah, I have a few things to say. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick folder. Exhibit A, the original parking notice that had been forced onto him without consent. He slapped it onto the table. First off, let's talk about this. The illegal reassignment of my driveway as community parking. Nowhere in my HOA agreement did I consent to this. A few people in the audience nodded in agreement. Linda's lips tightened. The board has the authority. Jake cut her off. Actually, I checked the bylaw. He pulled out Exhibit B, a copy of the HOA regulations with several lines highlighted. The HOA cannot designate privately owned driveways as community spaces without a signed homeowner agreement. Linda blinked. Jake smirked. Gotcha. The reason you never showed me that clause, Linda, is because you knew this entire thing was shady. A few people in the audience murmured louder. Someone actually clapped. Linda quickly recovered. Well, regardless, she said, shifting tactics, you still installed dangerous obstructions that could injure residents, which directly violates. Jake pulled out Exhibit C, a printout of HOA Rule 22D. Actually, I followed HOA guidelines. Safety measures for private property are fully permitted. Linda's face turned an alarming shade of red. The crowd wasn't just murmuring anymore. People were openly questioning her. Then Jake played his final card. He pulled out his phone. I also have some interesting recordings. He tapped play. The room went dead silent as Linda's voice, clear as day, echoed through the speakers. He's just some stubborn guy. We'll make his life miserable until he gives up. Gasps erupted from a few people. Linda froze. Jake leaned back, arms crossed. So tell me, Linda, do you still want to talk about community values? She looked around the room, panic setting in. For the first time, she wasn't in control. A man in the crowd stood up. I told you this was a power trip, Linda. Another woman shook her head. This isn't how an HOA is supposed to work. A board member tore off his name tag and walked out. Linda stammered, scrambling for words. This is out of... A senior resident raised a hand. I motioned to dismiss the motion against Jake. A second hand shot up. I seconded that motion. Linda paled. She was losing the board. Her board voted against her. The motion failed. Jake was free. And then came the final blow. One of the older residents adjusted his glasses. Actually, I think it's time we discuss a motion to remove Linda as HOA president. The color drained from her face. Jake smiled. Game over. The vote was swift, brutal, and completely one-sided. One by one, hands shot up. I vote to remove Linda as HOA president. I second it. I third it. Linda sat frozen, her clipboard shaking slightly in her hand. The once confident, smug ruler of the HOA was now nothing more than a cornered animal desperately trying to regain control. This is outrageous, she sputtered. You can't just throw me out because of one misunderstanding. The board members, the very people who had once nodded along to her every demand, now looked at her like she was toxic waste. One of the senior members, Mr. Dawson, sighed and took off his glasses. Linda, we trusted you to make decisions that were fair for the community. He gestured toward Jake. This wasn't about fairness. This was about you exerting control where it didn't belong. The entire room murmured in agreement. Then the votes started rolling in. Aye. Within seconds, it was official. Linda had been removed as HOA president. Jake watched as realization dawned on her face. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Then, without another word, she stormed out of the meeting, her heels clicking furiously against the tile floor. The moment the door slammed shut, the room erupted. Some people were cheering, others were laughing, shaking hands, or openly thanking Jake for standing up to her. Someone even bought him a beer after the meeting. And just like that, The HOA dictatorship crumbled. The fallout. Linda wasn't just removed, she was humiliated. With her iron grip on the neighborhood gone, people started questioning everything. Residents began demanding policy reversals. All the ridiculous rules she had enforced over the years, from lawn height restrictions to banning certain house colors, were now up for debate. Within a few months, the HOA was completely restructured. The new board was a mix of rational, reasonable homeowners who actually cared about the community rather than using it as their personal kingdom. And Jake, he was finally free. No more fines, no more random strangers using his driveway, no more Linda. Linda's downfall. Of course, Linda didn't take her defeat gracefully. She became a pariah in the neighborhood. People avoided her like the plague. Even her old allies on the HOA board refused to acknowledge her. The final nail in the coffin. She sold her house and moved out. One day, Jake saw the for sale sign in her yard, and he knew he had won the war. But he wasn't done having a little fun. Jake's final act of petty revenge. A few days after Linda left, Jake threw a massive neighborhood barbecue. In his front yard, he called it the HOA Liberation Party. Everyone came. There were grilled steak burgers, music, and a whole lot of people drinking beers and laughing at how things used to be. At one point, his buddy nudged him, "Dude, you should put up a plaque or something, in honor of your victory." Jake thought about it, and then he did one better. The very next day, he went online and ordered a custom-made driveway sign. A few weeks later, it arrived. Jake installed it right at the edge of his driveway. It read, "Private property, HOA, free zone. Trespassers will get flat tires." It was perfect, and just like that, his driveway was his again, the final laugh. One evening, a familiar face showed up at the end of the cul-de-sac. Todd, the obnoxious neighbor who had yelled at Jake when his BMW hit the spike. Jake smirked as he watched Todd approach cautiously, looking at the sign and then glancing around nervously. Hey Jake," Todd muttered. Jake leaned on his porch railing. "What's up?" Todd scratched the back of his head. "Listen, man, I might have overreacted back then, with the tires." Jake raised an eyebrow. Todd cleared his throat. "Oh, well, now that Linda's gone, I was wondering if I could, park in your driveway again." Jake didn't say a word. Instead, he walked over, pressed a button on his phone, and activated the motion-triggered sprinklers. Todd screeched as water blasted him in the face. Jake simply took a sip of his beer and smiled. No parking. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more insane HOA stories.